Hi everyone, welcome to week 7. In this week's online lecture, we're going to be talking about geographies of culture and language. And to just kind of jump right in here, what we're going to do is talk about a little bit about culture, different ways of kind of categorizing culture. And we'll talk a little bit about language, introduce some of the stuff that we'll talk about when the next video you'll watch for this section is on conflicts in the Ukraine. And then in class, we're going to get a little more into talking about language specifically. So to kind of start off with, when we're talking about culture and how we're categorizing it, there's a lot of different ways that we can split up the way we think about it. And one of the things we're going to be doing in the coming weeks is we'll look at different aspects of culture, like language, like religion, these kinds of things. But in this lecture, I just want to talk about different ways that we can kind of divide it up and categorize it. So on one level, when we talk about cultures, we can think about it in terms of what we call material culture versus non-material culture. In other words, there are things that we do in our everyday lives, some of which are tangible. You can touch them, right? So for instance, things that are made that we use in our culture. What are our clothes, right? For instance, what do our buildings look like? What kind of tools and technologies do we use? What does our art look like? It's visible. It's the things that you can see. But there's also the non-material culture that is also really important for kind of holding our cultures together. What are our beliefs, our values, our stories, the music we listen to, right? Things that the traditions we pass down from generation to generation that are also part of what we do. And so a lot of times in this class, what we really focus on is material culture, what you can see, particularly out in the landscape, but also like in this section when we talk about language, that tends to be more of a non-material culture kind of a thing. And one of the things that the book gets into is this idea that, culture is different for everybody. Also the idea that everybody has a culture, of course, and that what we're used to is different based on what we've learned and what we're accustomed to. So the book gets into this idea of, would you eat these? It depends on how hungry I am, I suppose, but it wouldn't be my first choice, right? But we all know that different groups of people in different places are into different kinds of foods is one example of kind of cultural difference. But when we're talking about ways of thinking about different types of culture, I want to kind of divide it up into a few different types here in this lecture. And the first type of culture to be aware of is what's called folk culture. Folk culture in the definition here, right, is it's a rural, kind of unified, largely self-sufficient, a culture associated with those kinds of groups. They share similar customs and ethnicity, and a lot of things are kind of handmade. And so it's sort of sometimes what we think of as being kind of like the original culture of a place, or at least the older culture of a place. And so in a place like Bavaria in southern Germany, it would be kind of wearing things like wearing this kind of dress, these sorts of hats, dancing the Schulplattler, I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly, maybe, certain kinds of dance, right? And that's kind of considered the traditional culture. And you can go to Bavaria and you can still see this. But it's a little different than kind of the modern culture. It's usually kind of set up as being sort of separated. This also operates here in New England, where most people in New England, of course, live what we would call kind of a modern culture or popular culture. But there's this idea that out in the rural areas of New Hampshire and Vermont and maybe Maine as well, that there are people that have farmhouses that are, collecting maple syrup and have dairy cows. And that's sort of the folk culture of what New England is, right? That kind of older, more rural, self-sufficient kind of existence. So we kind of contrast folk culture with popular culture, whereas popular culture is kind of, the modern way of life associated with mass-produced, machine-made goods, long-distance communication. And so popular culture in some respects is more of a global culture, something we all share. And so that might be the fact that certain styles of Western dress like this is something that you can see pretty much anywhere in the world. Most folks around the world are aware of and listen to, popular music, whether that be from the United States or from Europe or from Korea or wherever it might be. That's all kind of part of popular culture. One of the things that some people have sort of criticized popular culture for is that it sometimes is referred to as placelessness. And we've talked about this a little bit when we talked about globalization and just the idea that different parts of the world, when popular culture comes in, it kind of makes every place a little more similar because we're listening to the same music, wearing the same fashions, that sort of thing. And of course, that's characterized as sort of separate from the traditional, more folk culture that might be in those areas. Yet another type of culture that we talk about sometimes is what's called diaspora culture. And a diaspora is when a certain group of people, like a certain ethnic group, spread out or move all around the world. And so there are different diasporas. One of the earlier ones that people talk about is Judaism, and when people that were, Jewish communities that were centered in the Middle East fled from Palestine and then set up communities all over Europe, and then later also North Africa, and then also later moved to Latin America, the United States, etc., kind of all around the world. But you had these Jewish communities that kept a lot of their cultural traditions intact, even though they were spread out all over. Another good example of that is like Italian culture, and the way in which, like, you can go to a place like New York City and there's a little Italy, but there's also Italian areas in Latin America and in other parts of the world where folks have moved from Italy, and that's also considered kind of a diaspora culture. Also, like certain Caribbean groups, like from Puerto Rico, and there's certain parts of towns in different parts of the United States that are associated with that Puerto Rican identity. And of course, that's true for a lot of different ethnic groups as well. Another way that we characterize culture is sometimes referring to indigenous culture versus national culture, right? Whereas indigenous cultures are, of course, it's different than folk cultures in that indigenous cultures are the original inhabitants, the first people that came to a particular place. That may not necessarily be true for folk culture. Like, so for instance, in New England, folk culture is usually associated with European settlers, but more from maybe like the 1800s kind of time period, doing things like sheep farming and dairying and maple syrup production and that kind of stuff. Of course, the indigenous cultures in these areas are tribes like the Abenaki and others that lived in this area pre-European contact, and their culture is very, very distinctive and different languages, etc. And so it says here, a culture group that constitutes the original inhabitants and is distinct from the national culture. In other words, aspects of that culture, like language, certain traditions, will be different from what might be in sort of the surrounding areas, which might be more of a settler colonist culture. Generally, a lot of these indigenous cultural areas are sometimes associated with non-urban rural spaces, but a lot of that's because those are the areas where sort of the colonial project hasn't quite touched as much as some of the more central areas of the settler colonist state. And so, it says here, in effect, these are people who were colonized mostly, but not exclusively, by European cultures, and now tend to be people that are now in the minority in their own homelands, right? They've been kind of pushed out of their areas by processes of colonization. And again, this happens all over the place, not just in the United States, but also in other parts of Latin America and areas in northern Thailand, for instance. There are indigenous cultures that are different from the dominant cultures that are down in more the river valley areas. And also in China. China actually has a lot of different ethnic groups. About 90% of the population is Han Chinese, which is considered to be sort of the dominant ethnic group associated with China. But there are many indigenous peoples, particularly in the south, part of the south and the west part of China, that are speak different languages, have different cultural traditions, and do not consider themselves to be Chinese. And so these cultural regions, right, where indigenous peoples are, tend to be very different in terms of what's going on there. And mentioned, a lot of these places tend to be in areas we think of as more remote because those are the places that they've been able to sort of find refuge in and protect their cultural traditions, where the dominant society hasn't dominated quite to the same extent. And so if you look in the United States, where, like, for instance, indigenous groups are mostly concentrated, a lot of them are in the areas of the Intermountain West, where a lot of Native American groups, of course, were pushed out or eliminated in terms of a genocide, of course, that started in the 1600s and continued on through to the present day. where folks were pushed out. You can see Oklahoma has a large number of indigenous folks, and a lot of that's because that was set aside as where a lot of the tribes from the eastern part of the United States were forced to move to, and then later that was opened up for European settlement, which then displaced Native American groups there too. But you can kind of see where those areas are in the U.S. Going to other parts of the world in terms of indigenous people, there's actually a really good book called The Art of Not Being Governed by a scholar named James Scott. And one of the things that he really points out is that when you go to these areas with a lot of indigenous peoples that are up in these mountains, and he looked at these examples from northern Burma, now Myanmar. And one of the things that he really emphasizes is that groups that we sometimes refer to as indigenous peoples are not necessarily sort of cultural remnants of, that have been around forever and ever and ever, and are somehow haven't been in connection with the dominant societies. He kind of argues against that. He says that what's been going on actually is that a lot of the people that live up in these hills that are considered indigenous peoples, particularly in these parts of Asia, actually were people that were part of those civilizations in the valley bottoms and sort of the larger society, but they're people who fled and left those societies to kind of set up newer cultures actually in the mountains, and that these aren't like, in a sense, original cultures. And so one of the things that he emphasizes is that cultures are made, and they're made in interaction with the other groups that are around them. That's kind of an interesting example of that. Another example of kind of the way we can think about how cultures are made is through what we sometimes refer to as subcultures, right? They're usually, some aspect of they're within a larger culture, but are different in some particular way. And so subcultures may reveal differences along racial, religious, gender-related, and other lines of distinction. So the definition here of subcultures is groups of people with norms, values, and material practices that differentiate them from the dominant culture. So for instance, in the United States, hippies would be a subculture. Punks would be a subculture. Hip hop would be a subculture. And then one of the things that the book brings up is LGBTQIA plus districts, where people with gender identities and sexual preferences that maybe are different than sort of the standard in the larger society create regions and areas where that subculture is more welcome, more protected, and more kind of shown to exist in place in a normalized way. And so that's fairly common that, most cities have different districts that are associated with these different types of subcultures, as well as, some the usual things too, where we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, race and ethnicity in cities and the way in which kind of segregation around cities happens around ethnic group. There's also kind of subcultural spaces in particular cities too. And again, this is distinct from what we call the national culture. And this is a little different than popular culture. So popular culture is sort of a global, identified by, kind of partaking in things like the global music scene and all of that. National culture is associated with a particular nationality, right? So it says here the idea that citizens possess a set of recognizable values, behaviors, and beliefs, often including the same ethnic and linguistic traits, but not always, that express the core belief of each modern nation. So for instance, we might talk about French culture or English culture or Japanese culture. Those would be an example of national cultures. And, it says here, in the U.S., we think about what is the U.S. national culture. And it's interesting because there's a few different ways we could think about that. We could think about sort of our agricultural beginnings from around the Revolutionary War time period as being sort of a kernel of its national culture. Cowboy, kind of westward expansion, frontier culture is also sometimes thought of as sort of a core part of our national culture. And so there's a lot of threads that go into it. But one of the things we have to talk about here, and we'll get into this more when we talk about politics and geography and international politics and such, but we need to talk a little bit about a couple of terms that sometimes get blended together that we have to be very specific about, and I'll explain why. And those terms are nation, state, and country. And let me go to this next slide. Okay, so you've probably heard a lot of these things, particularly country and nation, being used as synonyms. In the social sciences, we don't do that. We have some very specific definitions of these terms. A nation is what we refer to as an imagined community. And what that means is we define a nation as people that all think of themselves as belonging together. So a nation could be Americans. We all identify as Americans and we think of ourselves as together and kind of being a political and cultural and social unit. But a nation could also be very different. So for instance, indigenous groups will think of themselves as nations. So you have the Navajo Nation, the Cherokee Nation, etc. Also, there are groups of people that do not have countries that think of themselves as a nation. The Kurdish people in the Middle East, for instance, there's no country of Kurdistan, but there's a group of people that all think of themselves ethnically as being similar, and they imagine themselves to be all one people. In the example that follows this about the Ukraine, you'll see that there's one country, but really there's kind of at least two nations in there. Group of people that think of themselves as Ukrainian, that speak the Ukrainian language primarily, and then there are people who think of themselves as ethnically Russian, and they speak Russian, and they both live in the Ukraine, in that country, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as being part of the same nation. Another example of this would be Northern Ireland, where you have people who believe themselves to be Irish, and then you have people that believe themselves to be British, and they're in the same place, and it can create difficulties and troubles because you're trying to figure out how to govern that area when the groups of people in it think of themselves as two different cultures and peoples that head into conflict with each other. So nation is an imagined community. Another key term, the state. When in social sciences, when we talk about the state, we don't mean the state of New Hampshire or the state of Massachusetts or the state of Maine or whatever. We think of the state, the term is basically the apparatus that governs. So it's sort of like saying the government, except that it's a little bigger than what we usually think of when we say the government. The state is, like in the United States, what we think of as the state would be the executive branch with the president and all of that, but also the Congress and also the courts and also the police that enforce the laws, right? And so it's all of these institutions together we call sort of the state. A country then is a territorial unit, an area governed by a single state, right? By a single institution or apparatus of political control. And in most countries, it's pretty cut and dry. Like for instance, France, there's the French state. It governs the territory of France. And you might even say that then everyone within that area thinks of themselves as French, although that's not entirely true. But that's this idea. Oops, hold on, I'll get to sovereignty. That gets to the idea of what we call the nation state. That is an ideal form of how nation, state, and territory should match up. And so an example might be Sweden. We think of it as there's the country of Sweden, a certain area. There's the state of Sweden, the government, right, that runs Sweden. And the idea that everybody in there thinks of themselves as Swedish and is sort of all in the same kind of group that imagines themselves to be together. The thing is that that's actually an anomaly in that there are many countries where that's not true. So for instance, I brought up the example of the Kurdish people in Middle East. So in a place like Iraq, it is not a nation state because you have the Kurdish people in Iraq, you have Sunni Muslims, you have Shia Muslims, and there's been all sorts of conflicts, but the way it's set up is there's kind of one state, one government that's supposed to run all of Iraq, but there's very little agreement of which nation should sort of be in control of that state, and also a lot of distrust because of violence that has happened, that if you let one of the other groups run the state, that you're going to be okay and have security. And we'll see in the example after this on the Ukraine that that's also going on with like Ukrainian people that think of themselves as Ukrainian, people that think of themselves as Russian. So like Ukraine is not really what we'd consider a nation state because you have multiple nations sort of arguing over who should run the state. So that leaves that one term here, sovereignty. And sovereignty just means control over a territory. So we might say a state has sovereignty over the country. And that's usually the case, although not always. So for instance, In some countries, like again, Iraq is a great example. You have the Iraqi government, and they kind of control the whole area, but not really, because there's always parts of the country that's rebelling against them. You have you have the northern part that's Kurdish, which is sort of trying to run itself to some degree. Syria is another good example where different groups are controlling each area and have actual sort of sovereignty on the ground. And as you'll see in the Ukraine example, there are parts of the Ukraine that are not really under the control of the Ukrainian state. And so sovereignty is oftentimes contested, and we'll get more into that when we talk about politics. Two more terms here that will bring us into our discussion of the Ukraine. One is separatism and one is irredentism. And that's when essentially you have a group of people in a country that are not satisfied with the way things are set up and being part of that country. So for instance, separatism, let's use an example, let's say hypothetically here for the United States. Separatism is when a group of people want to form their own country. So let's say that in New Hampshire, we want it to be our own country. We're like, oh, that's it, we're leaving the United States and we're going to create the Republic of New Hampshire. We would be separatists, right? And some examples of that would be like South Sudan, which is one of the newer countries in the world, where the southern part of Sudan is very different linguistically, culturally, religiously. The northern Sudan, they fought a long civil war over this, and that the separatists wanted their own country, and eventually they basically got it. So South Sudan is now its own country. East Timor wanted to separate from Indonesia, and they did. And then like Kurdish areas wanting to start their own independent country of Kurdistan would be other separatists. Irredentism is when you're not happy with where you are. But not that you want to be independent, you want to be part of the country that is next to you, right? The term irredentism also means when people in a country kind of want land outside of their country to kind of bring it in. So for instance, the example you'll see in the Ukraine, you have parts of the Ukraine where there's a large percentage that want to be part of Russia. That's irredentism. They don't necessarily want to be an independent country of Eastern Ukraine. They think of themselves as Russian. They would like that part of the Ukraine to be taken and annexed and become part of Russia. Ireland would be a good example of that too, or Northern Ireland, where you have people in the northern part of the island of Ireland, which is under British control in Northern Ireland, but they would like to join the Republic of Ireland, which is the south part of the island. That's another example of irredentism. For example, here for New Hampshire, if we said, well, we don't want to be part of the United States, we want to be part of Canada, that would be irredentism. And so what you'll see now is an example of that in the Ukraine video. And just to kind of set it up, we talked about this, I think, very early in the first week or so of class a little bit, but this idea that if you look at this part of the country of Ukraine, it is predominantly Ukrainian speaking. If you go to this part of the Ukraine, it's predominantly Russian speaking, and many of the people there think of themselves as Russian. And so when the Ukraine and Russia were together as part of the Soviet Union, it didn't really matter that much because really the government or the state that really ran everything was based in Moscow, and it was all done together. But after the Soviet Union collapses and Ukraine becomes an independent country, but you have all these people in it that think of themselves as Russian, then all of a sudden this border between Russia and Ukraine started to matter more. And you'll see kind of what goes on in that video. But just to also kind of set that up, one thing you have to recognize is that Russia is an empire. The majority of its land that Russia now covers has been sort of added on to its original, where it sort of started, which is right around Moscow. It has expanded out and out and out. Usually when we think of empires, we think of like the British Empire or the French Empire or the Spanish Empire, which is by ship sort of taking over other areas, like the British had India and the British had, of course, the United States and these other colonies. Russia did it on land and just kind of kept expanding outward. And because of that, there's actually a lot of people within the country of Russia that do not see themselves as ethnically Russian. That are other ethnic groups within that country because the territory that the Russians kind of took and expanded belonged to other cultural groups. And some of those areas include Ukraine. It's territory that was added back in time. But then after the Russian Empire kept expanding out, people of Russian background moved into these areas and populated it so that now you have Russians sort of all around this space, but they're mixed in with these other ethnic groups. And that's particularly true in like the border areas around in Kazakhstan and Ukraine and other locations. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're looking at this next video. Okay, so that's it for this section. Don't forget to answer the discussion questions after you watch the Ukraine video, and I will see you in class.